Hello, I'm John David Ebert, and welcome to the third class of the fourth week of our series on understanding contemporary art. Last time we began to look at the works of Gerhard Richter, and in this video and the following video we will look at the rest of his oeuvre in a certain amount of detail. What I want to do in this video is just to focus narrowly on 2 years of Richter's development, the years between, or rather 3 actually, 1968 to 1970, 68, 69, and 70. Which is a period of transition for him somewhat. This is the period after he is a student at Dusseldorf and before he returns back to the Kunstakademie at Dusseldorf in 1971 to become a professor there for 15 years. So he was arriving as a teacher at the Kunstakademie at about the same time that Joseph Beuys was in the process of resigning and leaving. But just before he got there, I think his art underwent some very interesting transformations that I want to look at in some detail. Now, two of the main concerns of Richter's art during this period is his examination of the sort of metaphysics of the landscape on the one hand and the portrait study on the other. Now, the landscape and the portrait study are iconotypes that came in during the age of what Heidegger calls the world picture, the age of the world as a picture, that is to say the age from the Renaissance, let's say from about 1450 down to, as we have seen with the Impressionist painters, down to Manet right around 1860. During that period, the age of the world as a picture was the age of depth perspectival space, wherein the world was a three-dimensional unification of objects in space. And the main iconotypes that came in during that period were indeed the landscape on the one hand, the great portrait study on the other, and the still life. Those are the three iconotypes that began to displace, during that period, the previous medieval iconotypes, which had been the spatial and chronotypical structuring features of the medieval worldview, the crucifixion, the Assumption of Mary to heaven, the Last Supper, the beheading of John the Baptist, all those kinds of iconotypes. Those get displaced now. And especially the portrait study, as we'll see, the portrait study is something that comes in, the portrait study of the average, ordinary, everyday individual, usually a wealthy merchant or a bourgeois, but it might also be royalty, that comes in and is plugged right into the same iconotype that had been the close-up portrait facial studies of Christ. Especially, this was an inheritance of, from the Byzantine world of Christ Pantocrator, the all-seeing gaze of Christ, whose eyes bored into you. No matter where you were, his eyes could see you, and that became the motif of the eye of God, of course, during the Renaissance. But that motif of the close-up painting of Christ was displaced by the portrait study, and that motif comes in to fill that semiotic vacancy during that world age. Now, Gerhard Richter, as a post-metaphysical artist, during this period from 68 to 1970, went in his artwork and began to examine these iconotypes, and basically they exist during this period under erasure in his art. So let's take a look at some of the images here. This is Corsica in 1968. This is really the first of the series of landscape paintings that he does. Now we're on the plane. Last time we had seen that Richter's art underwent a bifurcation, so that there was a second plane of signification, an abstract plane of formative energies, or a plane of consistency, or a plane of intensivities. It has multiple names, and Deleuze refers to it in 1,000 Plateaus with multiple names, versus the plane of organization, the plane of law-bound visual forms, which would correspond in art to the plane of figurative representation. That's the plane we see him developing here for the most part with these landscape and portrait studies. This is Corsica, and note that the painting has a kind of dreamlike, oniric quality to it. There's something kind of fake about it, something not convincing. That will be significant in a moment. Here is Bridge by the Sea from the same period. This is 1968. It looks as though, I don't know for sure, but it looks as though it might be based on a Polaroid. These are photo paintings then. He's returned to the genre of the photo painting where he blows up a painting to canvas scale and then overpaints it. This one is Landscape near Hubblerath from the same period, 1969 or thereabouts. And again, we can see this sort of, note the expansion of space, the sense of the sublime, and the opening up of space. These are, at first glance, and to the superficial gaze, the old characteristics of the Romantic landscape painting. But they can't be confused with, as some of Richter's critics confuse them, with what Richter is doing at this point. This is the Seascape Cloudy of 1969. It's got a kind of Caspar David Friedrich quality to it. It reminds one of his Monk by the Sea. And here is Cloud of 1970, another photo painting. Now all of these paintings have a kind of spatial expansion about them that reminds us of the Dutch experience. This is Van Goyen's, just to remind us, this is Van Goyen's estuary scene from 1652. Of the Dutch experience in the 17th century, who were really the first, as I've said, to discover infinite space. And after the collapse of the world-enclosing cavern-like Christian macrosphere, after it collapsed, the Dutch celebrated its collapse with their discovery of infinite space, the opening up of light and expansiveness and the sublime in painting. And I think there's a similar opening and expansiveness in these landscape paintings that we have just looked at of Richter's from this period. And so at first glance, it may look as though he were simply returning, as his critics said of these paintings, to the kitsch of romantic landscape paintings. However, what makes these paintings very different from the traditional landscape painting is that they are photo paintings. They are paintings based on pre-existent photographs, and therefore they are not, the gaze is a mediated gaze. It has been plugged into the mediatized matrix. This is the landscape that has been imprisoned. It is an imprisoned and captured landscape. Nature exists now on the inside of human technology, on the inside of human culture, and Richter is painting the capturing and imprisonment of nature inside the mediatic matrix. This is not an unmediated gaze of the Dutch painter sitting out by the harbor painting the ships coming in as he sees them. That's unmediated. This is a mediated gaze where he's looking through the lens of Paul Virilio's vision machine, which has captured nature now, and it exists on the inside of human culture, and there simply is no way in which the unmediated experience of the individual and the sublime fusion with nature can be recaptured anymore. Not in today's world. Everything is mediatized. Everything exists on the inside of the world interior of capital and its digitization processes. That's what Richter's capturing in these landscapes. This is metaphysics under erasure. He's essentially crossing out and erasing the landscape iconotype, as he does with all of his works to some degree or another. He's always crossing something out. Along about the same time, 1970 then, we have the 48 portraits. He did 48 portraits of great men, traditionally great men, painted them, put them on a wall. But the interesting thing about them now, so now he's turning to the other great iconotype of the age of the world picture, the portrait study. Here's a close-up of one of them. This is Igor Stravinsky. And we note there that the first thing to note about them is that nowhere does the name for the individual appear under any of these portraits. Here is Rilke. They look kind of out of focus. He has overpainted all of these portraits in the same brush strokeless style, and they're a little bit out of focus. They're a little bit blurry. They look as though we're looking at them underwater. And if we look back at the portraits, then what we see here is not really the portrait of a series of great men in classic grand style of portrait studies. What we see here is a collective assemblage. These individuals are no longer Cartesian cogitos, the great transcendental subject that was already anticipated in art. If we look back at Jan van Eyck here, his self-portrait, or what might be a self-portrait, a portrait of a man of 1433, that's when the portrait study is invented. And another great one here, one of the greatest ever, is Giovanni Bellini's Doge Loredano from 1505. And here we can see the crisp, almost HD-like quality and focus and clarity. This is the transcendental subject before Descartes discovers him in philosophy a century later. This is the transcendental subject of the West, the cogito that now begins to replace the iconotypical studies of the close-up portrait of Christ, the all-seeing gaze of Christ, Christ Pantocrator. These are the portraits that plug into that semiotic vacancy, which now, I think that Richter, with his portraits of great men, glancing back at Igor Stravinsky here, is now deconstructing and erasing and drawing a line through. These men are no longer separate individuals with their deeds celebrated. They are gathered together in a collective flock, an assemblage, and they're all re-embedded back onto a single plane of signification where no single one of them stands out. They are put back into an anonymous subject, the collective assemblage, the collective assemblage of enunciation. They are no longer points of subjectification. They are no longer subjects of enunciation, transcendental subjects no more. Richter is erasing them. He's drawing a line through the traditional subject. They are no greater than anyone else in his aniconic portrait study. And then if we look at Richter's other plane of signification during this time, this is Detail Brown from 1970. This is the plane of signification of his abstract art, the sort of plane of intensivities. we notice that by comparison with the earlier plane that he had began to paint, these are no longer static images. Something's happening. This painting here looks as though there's an air of tense expectancy about it, as though something were about to happen. And here with detail red-blue, we can see that something is indeed happening. The energies on his second plane of signification are in motion. They're doing something now. They're moving along into morphogenetic processes. This is detail gray lilac from 1970. They're moving right along, and they're moving into morphogenetic dynamic processes. They're on the way to the formation of something, and what they will form will be the subject of our third and final video on Gerhard Richter.